A final farewell is given to Dr. Charles H. Caylor, son of Dr. Truman Caylor, nephew of Dr. Harold Caylor, grandson of the founder and namesake, Dr. Charles E. Caylor, and great-grandson of Dr. David Samuel Caylor. For over 140 years, a Caylor has delivered medical care in Northeast Indiana. While this brings down the final curtain on one of America's great medical families, it is only the end of a chapter, because Caylor Nickel stands ready to enter the 21st century, fortified with a tradition for excellence that encompasses the vision of its founder, Charles E. Caylor.
For the first time, there's not a Caylor leading our organization. But before Dr. Charles died, he worked very hard at helping us develop a vision statement that encompasses everything that Dr. Charles, Bessie, Harold Truman, and Chad himself believed in. We use that vision statement to guide us in everything that we do today.
Charles and Bessie Caylor inherited much, not in the way of material possessions, but things much richer, namely a deep religious faith, a strong work ethic, and an idealism that was evident by the care and concern they gave their patients for over 50 years. For those who knew them personally, the memory of their commitment is still alive.
He had a lot of respect for patients. He was very concerned, and everybody was a special person and a special patient to him.
If they wanted something we didn't have, he saw that, saw that they got it, I can remember somebody that wanted goat's milk, and he went out to the country and got them goat's milk, and just things like that.
They cared for the patient. We were taught that we're here for the patient.
We just grew up with the clinic, knowing that the patient did come first, and the doctors looked for the good of the patient.
They really did care. They didn't leave anything unturned to try to get that patient feeling better. They were so dedicated.
I think grandmother and grandfather felt very close to any patient, so the quality of care was tremendously important.
Grandpa was dedicated to his patients. That was the most important thing to him.
Charles was born on April 17, 1870, into a family that were staunch members of the Conservative Church of the Brethren, known as the Dunkard Church. Charles's father, David Samuel, was so steeped in the strict fundamentalist tradition that, after years of medical training, he changed the focus of his ministry from medicine to preaching.
Around 1883, David and Mary and the family with Charles settled in Somerset, Indiana. Back in 1868, Bessie had also settled in Somerset.
Bessie was 7 years younger than Charles. Her family was scratching out a living on a farm following the death of her father. Those difficult times left Bessie with a financially conservative nature that would be a part of her personality her whole life.
Mother had been, her father died when she was just a little girl.
10 years.
And so her mother was as tight as a bark on a beech tree.
Charles Caylor was determined to be a doctor. Since his dad didn't have the resources to send him to medical school, Charles, as he would throughout his whole life, found a way.
Well, grandfather was not able to afford medical school, so he would teach 6 months of the year, and then the other 6 months he went to medical school. And frankly, he wasn't terribly much older than a lot of his students. In fact, he was not a tall person.
In fact, I would bet that Bessie was one of his students. Even though he grew his mustache to look older, he still kind of melted when she was in his presence, and that was a spark that never really died at all.
He continued his dual existence of both teacher and student until his graduation in 1893. The world that Charles faced as a young doctor was a place where almost all diseases were incurable.
Back when Dr. Charles first started practicing, we certainly didn't have any antibiotics like we do today, and infectious diseases were quite a problem, pneumonia and infections and things like that.
As promised, Charles married Bessie on November 14, 1893, in the front room of Bessie's family farm.
This is the house where I was born. On October 14th, 1893, I was married in the front room of this very same house. Charles asked my mother one Sunday afternoon in June if he might take her daughter, Bessie, me, for his wife. As Charles and I sat on the edge of the front porch, he asked me if I would be his wife.
After a brief stay at Gas City, the young couple moved to Nottingham.
Well, of course, grandmother really was a young wife. She was 17 years old when they were married, so she was a young wife. And I'm sure that living in a wildcatters community must have been a real shock to this sweet young thing who had come from Somerset, Indiana.
They dearly loved each other, and they complimented each other. Bessie was very frugal, yes. And Dr. Charles was willing to take chances, and she'd have to hold on to his coat's tails.
It was quite a place to establish a home, as it was a boom town. When wildcatters weren't looking for oil, they were looking for trouble. With money in their pockets and time on their hands, they provided young Dr. Caylor with a steady flow of patients.
One evening he was at home, and he answered the door, and there were 3 men at the door, and the 2 were supporting a man who was nearly limp, but he kept holding a hat to his abdomen. And the man had been stabbed in a fight, and his small intestines had protruded out, and he was holding them in his hat. Imagine. And Dr. Harold, or Dr. Charles, took care of that and got him back in, and the man survived. That was a miracle, I would say.
The next 4 years, Charles and Bessie spent in Nottingham passed quickly. Harold had been born on August 19, 1894. In 1897, a Dr. Horn, practicing 8 miles down the road in Pennville, invited Dr. Charles to join him in practice. Charles accepted the invitation, and Pennville became home to Charles and Bessie for the next 20 years. For Charles, a great deal of time was spent making house calls.
Grandfather actually had a bicycle, and he was one of the few physicians who made house calls on a bicycle.
It didn't take long for Charles and Bessie to establish quite a routine in Pennville.
Bessie did the business and Doctor did the doctoring.
Grandmother really wasn't a stay home and make cookies grandmother. In fact, if she made cookies, people usually were extremely sorry because a lot of times they were barely edible.
The Caylors celebrated the birth of a new century with the birth on January 10, 1900, of their second son, Truman. The start of the new century proved to be a time of great discovery and new ideas, both for the practice of medicine and for Charles himself. To keep up with new developments, he traveled regularly, especially for courses in surgical techniques.
We know that beginning around 1904, he would travel to see the Mayo brothers.
The Mayos were well on their way to building their Mecca of medicine, a clinic staffed by many doctors. Dr. Caylor immediately saw the advantages of practicing medicine in a group setting.
And he came back home, and usually, because he was a country doctor, we would meet at the dinner table. That was about the only place that the whole family could get together. And I remember I was 10 years old at this time, and Father came back from Rochester, and he said, if they can, these Mayo brothers, if they can do something like that up in Minnesota, maybe we can do something like this down here in Indiana.
At the time Dr. Charles first started his practice, he made several trips to the Mayo Clinic and liked the concept of group practice. many of the things that he thought of that were advantages with a group practice still hold true today. The main one being, in difficult cases, it's very easy to obtain consultations with other members of your group.
I think what would have certainly sparked an interest in him would have been the idea of having colleagues like himself who were immersed in learning more about diagnosing conditions and bringing the latest treatments to the patient.
He was really very progressive, and he instilled that in his sons, too.
The relationship between the Caylors and the Mayos lasted for many, many years. Charles went back to Rochester once or twice a year to take part in the Surgeons Club meeting, where new ideas and procedures were demonstrated and discussed. Harold would eventually go there for a great part of his training.
Dad went to the University of Chicago to Rush Medical College for his medical school. And he was very fortunate in that several of his professors suggested that he go to the Mayo Clinic for special training.
1904 also saw the end for Dutch. The faithful horse who knew the way home was replaced by not one, but 4 horses.
In 1904, thereabouts, we had our first automobile, which was a curved dash Olds that steered with a lever and had a single-cylinder 4-horsepower engine under the body, and downhill and with a wind to your back, you could get up to about 30 miles an hour.
The most important form of transportation in those days was the railroad. Without the railroad, people could not really get to where they needed to get to. You can imagine how dependable the old 4 Olds was, but the key was where that railroad went. And if the railroad didn't come through your town, you were really in the boondocks.
Although there's no sign of it today, the Cincinnati, Bluffton, and Chicago Railroad came right through Pennville. It carried patients to Pennville to see Dr. Caylor from good distances away. It wasn't long before the idea of building a hospital was discussed.
Other communities had hospitals that were in converted homes. Dr. Charles purchased a commercial building and converted it to a 10-bed hospital. And most of the cases in the hospital were surgical cases.
The second surgical procedure that was performed in Pennville was my grandfather removed my father's appendix. Dad was 10 years old at the time.
The 10-bed hospital was officially chartered by the state of Indiana on February 1st, 1908. Always the innovator, Charles equipped his hospital with the latest medical technology, including an X-ray machine. 5 years after the hospital first opened, it was expanded to 26 beds. In those days, the practice of medicine was a dangerous occupation, and it cost Dr. Charles more than just money.
A lot of times with surgical procedures, masks and gloves were not used, exposing the doctors to risks of infection.
And grandfather, of course, had problems with X-ray burns. Of course, X-ray was a very, very new concept, and very little was known about the danger to exposure or overexposure. So he ended up with one finger that was amputated, which was a real problem as far as his doing surgeries. He also lost vision in one eye as a result of a terrible ocular infection that he acquired doing a home delivery. And of course, there were no antibiotics, so if you had an infection, it was up to your own body to treat it.
1917. For many, it represents World War I. But for the town of Pennville, it means the CB&C shuts down. For the Caylors, long accustomed to treating patients from many miles around, the closure of the railroad forced a tough decision.
CB&C Railroad, the old corned beef and cabbage, was extremely important to the clinic in Pennville because a lot of their patients came by rail.
There were 3 possibilities: Portland, Hartford City, or Bluffton.
Bluffton was ideal. Dr. Charles wanted to get back to patient care. Bluffton was building a hospital, and Dr. Charles' patient base was located close to the Bluffton area.
Charles and Bessie went to work. Again, using their own savings, they purchased a lot on the southeast corner of Cherry and West Main Street in Bluffton.
Dad picked up every darn thing he could pick up to put into this building. He built this building, which we used as a clinic building for many years. He lived upstairs to begin with for 2 or 3 years. He built this building for $17,000. Lord, you could hardly get a bed for that now.
It was a family affair from the outset. The Bluffton Clinic, as it was known at that time, was well underway. Charles's dream of applying the Mayo concept to his own clinic became a reality when his sons joined the practice in the 1920s.
When Harold had left, I took over the spot that he had in the partnership, and had, I think it was about $600 of Harold's money that I had picked up that I intended to pay him. When he got back, then he came back in the fall of '29, just before the crash. And I paid him that $600 before the crash, and Lord, I like to never recovered from it. we had rough going from that time.
Hard times were not new for Bessie and Charles. It was their spirit in the face of yet more adversity that helped the new clinic survive the Great Depression. All around them, friends and neighbors lost everything. The clinic was not immune to the effects of the severe economic hardships. Cash was extremely tight. The Caylors borrowed on their life insurance and frequently went without salaries themselves because there was no money left after paying the staff.
People would bring in produce, you know, their gardens and maybe a chicken or whatever. But I remember the lady who worked for them, Pearl, someone.
Fisher?
Was that it? I don't know, but Pearl.
Whatever, Pearl.
She would say, "You should see our basement. We are full, all the shelves are full of canned vegetables and canned fruit. We'll never eat it." But people would bring it in, and Bessie would say, "Can it?"
He would never refuse to see a patient. It wouldn't make any difference who would come in. It didn't make Dr. Charles any difference. He would take care of them, and so would Harold and Truman. Now, if they owed a bill, then they'd have to deal with Bessie.
Medicine in the 30s was a difficult time, especially for patients, because it was in the middle of the Depression. We've all heard stories of how Dr. Charles received goods instead of money for payment. But in spite of the Depression, it was also an exciting time in medicine. Many of the X-ray techniques, medications, and surgical techniques had improved over the early days, making it much safer not only for the patient, but also for the doctor taking care of the patient.
Dr. Harold came back in '29, and then Dr. Nickel, who was at Mayo's and had worked with him at the same time, came back in '31. And after that, things really exploded. They brought so many ideas from what, you know, Mayo's being as progressive as they were. And it was then in the early 30s that we started doing blood typings for transfusions.
The way the name Caylor Nickel came into being was a gentleman's agreement. We all shook hands, and it became Caylor Nickel, and they all became partners.
Al was a good, an excellent internist. He had ideas that were different than ours once in a while, but he was a good person, and he did us a grand job, and we took him in as a partner. We used to say, you come in with nothing, you go out with nothing. That was a partnership agreement. Yeah.
Throughout the 30s, the clinic practice increased. The group practice concept had proven itself.
About 1940, Dr. Charles and the rest of the doctors ran into a problem. They were using Wells County Hospital, and the hospital was becoming overcrowded.
And when it became obvious that that hospital had to expand, the trustees said, no, we're a small county. We don't have the funds. We can't expand. And they said, well, what about if we charge more for out-of-county patients? And the Caylor said, no, we can't see that happening. We're bringing all these patients here. So there just became a difficult decision that had to be reached. I don't think anybody wanted to see it happen, but what happened was that the Caylors and medical staff, even though they petitioned to please allow us to have our patients be seen at the same rate as anyone else, that couldn't happen, so they went ahead and built their own hospital.
As usual, Dr. Charles, then 69 years old, acted from his heart and offered $10,000 toward the building fund for the new hospital. Bessie, as always, supported her husband's decision. Their sacrifice and confidence in their sons and colleagues is remarkable considering the country was still in a depression. $10,000 represented their entire life savings.
Well, knowing grandmother, it probably gave her severe indigestion, but she also felt very strongly that this was the future for Caylor Nickel, and it was so tremendously important that grandfather cashed in his life insurance. That's the source of the $10,000.
In 1940, Dr. Charles found himself back in the hospital business. That might have been the reason he turned the reins over to Harold and Truman at that time.
For Charles and Bessie, all the growth and expansion, whether buildings or staff, were for one purpose: to better serve the patient.
I recall one time, it was after a long, hard day, and was ready to go home, and the bus brought an old man who was a tramp, really, that suffered from rheumatism, and I had to give him a diathermy treatment, and I think I grumbled a little about it. And Dr. Charles soon put me in my place. He says, you know, this is, he's a human being, and he's in pain, and he really made me feel ashamed of myself. So I gave him this treatment, and after that I learned.
Chad, the grandson, followed in the tradition of all the Caylors. He was an excellent surgeon, an excellent physician. His special gift was the ability to find the means to finance the projects that were underway.
We've always been self-sufficient here, and I think that our self-sufficiency is shown by the fact we used to have to make cotton swabs ourselves, and I can still do it.
Building on Dr. Charles' vision, Harold, Truman, and Chad found that they were having to launch construction program after construction program to keep up with the demand of the patients. More and more people were seeking their care here at Caylor Nickel because they liked what they found. The population of physicians doubled, and 9 different construction programs took place over that period of time to accommodate the growing number of patients.
Charles never saw that expansion. On the evening of July 4th, 1944, while returning home from their cottage in Somerset, Charles and Bessie were involved in an automobile accident. In the collision, Charles struck his head and was knocked unconscious. The next day, at the hospital he helped build and under the prayerful eyes of his extended family, Dr. Charles Elias Caylor died.
It was on the 4th of July. It happened the evening of the 4th of July. And I didn't hear about it until the next day. Yeah. We were all just stunned.
Terrible.
And Bessie was a wreck. Mm-hmm. She stayed by his bedside on her knees. It was a traumatic experience for her.
He was, he absolutely loved life. He was such a vibrant person. And grandmother was just absolutely devastated. She really never recovered. I'm sure she felt responsible.
Bessie expressed her feelings to Charles shortly before he died.
I often think of our early dreams and especially yours, when apparently there was little or nothing to build upon except your own determination. I am so happy for all of us that you have had this idea and have been able to see it develop into this beautiful thing.